me dive into your film, which I really enjoyed. It just seems like a an understatement, but it was really a great piece of work. And I just wanted to start out by asking you what was the impetus? Like why did you decide to make this film? What was behind it?
So I just kind of felt that we were in a bit of a dangerous space as South Africans, because on the one hand, the rainbow nationalist ideal or idea is kind of reigning, right? But you have voices rising that, talk about like Mandela having sold this out, but also just a lot of voices and people questioning things, questioning our democracy. But what I found about these conversations was that they were mostly happening online on social media.
Right.
And it really just felt like, different factions sort of like shouting at each other from like the benches, and there was really no nuance. And then again, there wasn't a sort of like a controlled, not controlled, but there wasn't like a clear narrative about like what it is that we want to achieve by saying these things or asking these questions. They just kind of felt like wildfires, just sort of like propping up everywhere. And so I really also had a lot of questions about, genuinely, like about where we find ourselves in now. And I then wanted to have a conversation in the film about that. But how do we have a democracy that was once seen as the best democracy in the world, but yet at the same time also be the most unequal society in the world? Things just kind of didn't really add up, So yeah, so really wanted to have a frank and honest conversations about the state of our democracy.
Right, right. No, I think I mean it was very frank. It was admirable how frank everyone was. And to that point, like what was your process of like, the people you found, or the sort of the arc of your story? Because there really was there was a how do I say, a diverse set of voices, like people who are like in different, who do different things, from artists to scientists, so just how was that process?
Um, yeah, so what I find with these kind of films, with the kind of documentaries that deal with like, post-apartheid South Africa, is a lot of the time you have the same people speaking. It's a lot of the time it's like people who have like an insider's voice, who on some level were part of the shaping of like the new democracy, so people who were in the ANC or who worked in government, or part of the old guard, or who were sort of like journalists documenting the events of like say 1994 and right after that. And what I find is that there's kind of like very little that's different, in conversations in those phones about where we are and how we got to where we got. It kind of seemed overly curated, and it's still kind of sort of like inclined on the rainbow nationalist ideal, about the brilliance of Nelson Mandela and how we averted a civil war. And but no one really wants to speak about what's happening to us now, the conditions that we're living in as South Africans. If we are having a conversation about what's happening now, we almost always pointed to one thing, and that's, corruption. And so I wanted to have a diverse sort of like panel of voices. They're going to speak about the fallacy of this idea of the rainbow nation. But not only that, I wanted people to come sort of like diverse backgrounds, because I knew that if it was sort of like one, like sort of like strata of like our society, then it wouldn't be as honest as I wanted it to be. I was lucky because a lot of these contributors were already having these kind of conversations online. So I kind of knew the level of honesty they had towards this project, the Rainbow Nation project,
Right.
and that they could contribute to the film. But secondly, I really just wanted like different voices and not the same voices that we've heard over time.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the Rainbow Nation sort of and I don't know, talk. And I think in the film at one point it was referred to as the Rainbow Nation propaganda. And one of the people you interviewed also talked about how when you're um, seeing the rainbow, it's like there these, it's like all these colors that are together, but they're still separate. And I think that was, I guess, which comes back to the inequality. But is this sort of like a reigning thinking that somehow we were, in the excitement of the moment, there was like a con job that happened with this concept.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I'm actually happy that a lot more younger people are asking those questions now, because I feel like I belong to a generation of guinea pigs, right? Like we were supposed to be the ones that bought into that project. It was my generations that first went to white schools. I mean, there were sort of individuals that went to white schools before my generations, but it was literally like 5 people in a province kind of thing. Whereas now we go in droves. We're the ones who are kind of like witnessing all of this, the Mandela Project or the Rainbow Nation Project, and we're buying into it. We're singing the songs at schools. We drank the Kool-Aid. And we were never really.
South Africa, we love you songs.
Yes. So I mean, we had the badges. We sang the song in primary school, and everything was just about was like they were just pushing the reconciliation project. So from advertising, the commercials that you were watching, it was all just about like racial harmony in the country. The soap operas, the the sort of like the music and the musicians that were. The crossover musicians were given a lot more attention. So it was very deliberate. But I think a lot of us were still sort of under the haze of all of that euphoria. And so we didn't really have I guess the chance to sort of question a lot of things. But also, and I think a lot of people who had been fighting, or were just fresh out of, an almost 50-year-old oppressive regime. And I think it was also just a chance for all of us to just like, kick off our feet and just relax for a moment, and really feel what it is to be human and what it means to be alive with the fullest possibility, and how we can actually sort of like put hope into practice. And so then, a younger generation comes in and they can't afford university fees. But very aware of the living conditions they're in and how they contrast to that of like their peers at schools or at universities. And they start asking questions. I mean, with the Fees Must Fall movement and the Rose Must Fall movement, even asking questions about like the kind of education we're getting and the curriculum. And so I think then, those kind of sentiments start brewing, that spirit of just like wanting to question the status quo, wanting to hold their leaders accountable. Again, the sort of like the spirits of protest gets reignited because South Africa has a really strong and old tradition of protest. And so I think for me, it was also just about that, just like seeing a rise in like dissenting voices, and trying, to sort of like locate the dissent, to really ask where it's coming from. Because on the one hand, a lot of people wanted to forget the historical dispossession and those kind of things. And like I said before, and just sort of like limit everything that we're going to on, the corruption of our government. And so for me, it was kind of disingenuous to say, but wait, if we look around us, very little has changed structurally, even cosmetically. Not much has changed in terms of how South Africa looked economically in the late 80s or say the early 1990s. And so it really was for me like an opportunity to ask questions about what it is that we're doing with this democracy.
Right, right. It's it was an interesting thing. I was after I watched the film, uh, thinking about one of the things that came up that I think is probably a conversation that happens with at least, I can speak mostly about the continent of Africa, the countries that you find your independence, and then what was it, you get your, I guess it's a political liberation, but not necessarily an economic liberation. It's like when I would talk about it, it's like you get your anthem and you get your flag, and then that's probably the extent of it.
Oh, for sure. It almost feels like a trap. And I'll be completely honest with you and kind of like I'm just kind of like speak off script a little bit. In thinking about like corruption, especially, and looking at what a lot of sort of African leaders have done before, the sort of like slow development, nepotism. I mean, we've seen it. I mean, let's not lie to ourselves. And I wonder if are these people who are smarter than the rest of us, who have seen early enough that there is no way out of this trap, and therefore they're going to try and amass as much as they can for themselves and they can, and get out. Because then I really start then to ask questions about whether or not we can fix the system.
Right.
Because it seems to me that to a great extent that the system itself is rigged,
Right.
especially for a country like South Africa. South Africa is not a poor country by any stretch of imagination. We're a very rich country. And so for me, then this conversation about other African countries and their independence and what they've done with their independence then puts a spotlight on South Africa and what it is really that is holding us back. And so it really pushes us to a place where we ask serious and critical questions about the kind of freedom that we attained and how much of it is actually autonomy, because it really does feel like we were given the flag and the anthem and not much else.
Right.
I was actually reading earlier on about like the kind of the amount of corruption that was happening during apartheid and how a lot of sort of like the leaders were in cahoots with like the private sector in securing sort of these evergreen deals that would, set them up for life. And here we are today, we have kids in the township saying that they can't afford university fees, when some people are sitting off like, you know, you know, tons and tons of money. And nothing has changed. And so for me, and then you think about the other countries and, Francophone countries, still paying some sort of royalties to France and taxes and all of this thing. And I just wonder if it's a trap and if there is a way out of this trap. And so, yeah, it's an interesting question that you posed there.
It is. So I'm sure I will circle back to it because I want to sort of work towards it, talking about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, because that was it's often held up as like the gold standard, right? As like this is how you sort of peacefully resolve your issues. And I think even when Rwanda had the genocide, like they had their own version of it. And you think I thought I had a general understanding of it, but there were some surprises in it. Like apart from the conversation about like we sit and you tell me all the terrible things that you did, right? You don't apologize, you just sort of tell me, and maybe it's the truth, maybe it's not really. And then as we're supposed to move on. And I'm guessing that was not necessarily the case.
For sure. I mean, the only requisite was that you just come and you speak the truth. I mean, I think even an apology wasn't part of the condition. And it's, I think one of the, if I was to sort of criticize my own film, it would just be about how much time it didn't have in having sort of like a really full conversation about, a lot of the topics that are explored in the film. In that there was just so much more in the research. There was just so much more evidence of how the TRC, for example, was a farce, how I think one of the speakers in the film actually mentions this, is that actually, they sent the foot soldiers of apartheid, the people who were behind the engineering didn't even come to the TRC. So, I mean, there's also that, right? In that this one opportunity, golden opportunity for us to actually sort of sit and talk about what happened and really hold people to account was in some way, I guess, political theater. I mean, we watched it on TV every night. I remember coming back from school and in the afternoons, there'd be repeat episodes of the TRC that I probably wasn't even supposed to see because, some of those accounts were pretty grotesque.
Right.
But I think we don't even need to go into detail about how we were cheated as Black people in this country. It's ubiquitous. It's all around us. You can see spatial apartheid is still there. You could see who lives in the suburbs, who drives the fancy cars. I mean, this is kind of like a very simplistic evaluation of it, but it's the evidence is all there. And so, there's been talks recently about about maybe we should reopen the TRC. And I think it's a great idea because only a few people really, not even held to account, really got to sit there and talk about the brutalities they committed during apartheid.
Right. And if you didn't show up, did anything happen to?
No, nothing happened. It's, I think, about 2 years ago, P.W. Botha, who was the president before de Klerk, passed away. He died, and I think the Nelson Mandela Foundation released a statement. They try to be diplomatic, saying, "Oh, we are where he died." But there was really not much condolence, and also not, sort of like not much speaking ill. But the way I remember what hit me about his passing was just like how silent, how free, quiet, and dignified it was. He didn't deserve that. It was clear to me, and it should have been clear to a lot of people that he's an apartheid murderer.
Right.
He presided over the death of a lot of people, and I was mad. I was mad that he, up until that point, he had lived a quiet, sort of peaceful life. Had a sort of dignified, civilized death, and nothing was said of it. And I really started to think about really what we were kind of robbed of, because there are people now in Soweto and other townships of South Africa who have family members that died, and they don't even know where their bones are buried. And so it's kind of like that schizophrenic existence, right? You have this sort of golden democracy and constitution that's supposed to be an example to the rest of the world. And yet at the same time, you have these guys that won't and will, you know, were never even treated. And I think, like Bev says in the film, we live in a very dangerous space in South Africa because, you know, we also keep seeing a lot of protests, you know, a lot of protests sort of rising, and it will get to some sort of tipping point.
Right, right, right. I mean, one of the things that I noticed, I noted, was I guess the TRC came out with a report that it seems was completely disregarded, and is the sense that perhaps if some of those recommendations had been carried through, things might look a lot different, or at the very least, people might have been sort of people might have had to, you know, say where people who'd been killed had been buried, or, you know, sort of had to pay some sort of retribution in some way.
Yeah, I think, I mean, it was kind of a volatile period. And, you know, a part of me is, a part of me wants to criticize the leaders who negotiated and the kind of the concessions that they made, right? But I think I've seen enough and enough evidence to suggest that if that didn't happen, it was going to be a messy, you know, a messy war. And so I'm aware of that. So I think there's a part of me that says that I think they just got to a point where they didn't want to, you know, touch on too much, you know, when, you know, they'd kind of sort of worked themselves into a place where they felt that they had a little bit or some control or enough control to keep things going because they, you know, they were the governing party. And that, you know, some details could have, you know, could fall away, and that maybe that find time. I think they were trying to buy time, that maybe that find time to fix everything. And so I think what the TRC recommendations did, or the TRC report did, was it was actually asking for a lot of people to account. You know, some of the suggestions I think that were spoken about in the film about a wealth tax, for example, that was going to tax the private sector. That President Mbeki turned down, was for me, it sounds like a genius idea, right? Because a lot of these companies actually made the money off the backs of like an exploitative system. And that would be one way for them to sort of like to buy the way into reconciliation, so to speak. And so even that was turned down. So I think the deals were made already, and it was kind of, if they're taking those recommendations from the TRC report, it would undo a lot of things that they had already sort of agreed on.
Right, right. Yeah, because
Yeah.
you know, there were hints that you know, even as Mandela and whoever they, you know, the people at the table were having these conversations, and perhaps even looking at the TRC report, that there were external factors. Like, I don't know, I think there was mention of the West. There was mention, you know, maybe industry that impacted some of this, and you hinted at it. I don't know if you just have like more to.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, these were all kind of, I mean, some of them were really private conversations, and a lot of stuff that we were not kind of privy to. But then, I mean, this comes at the back of a lot of countries that sort of supported the socialists or the communists having um, having to sort of like, you know, let go, right? Because these are the countries that supported the liberation struggle, who were leaning towards, you know, Russia and the communists, you know, the Cubans supported a lot of liberation struggles in Africa, and then, you know, some of it's kind of like included the ANC, and so I think for me, the pressure came in that, right? Because now we have so much international attention, and a lot of it was really based on kind of like the economy and the economic systems that we sort of wanted to employ or deploy. And so to a great extent, I think the people who are now at the forefront of like the negotiations are the West, you know, countries like the USA and Britain, and not really so much the countries that were supporting us during our liberation struggle, because they'd kind of lost the Cold War, so to speak. And so people were really thinking about like being part of the international community and what that meant, you know. What does it mean to be a new country that sort of, you know, is coming out of like this oppressive system that only serviced a few, to now having to try and, you know, service like the majority of the country with, you know, with limited resources. And so I think it was important for them to kind of also, you know, try by all means, because when they came into power, they were speaking a different language. You know, Mandela was speaking about nationalization, you know, like nationalizing the mines and nationalizing the banks, until he went to Davos and he, you know, and came back and he said, "Oh no, we're not going to do that," you know. But even just the economic systems that were employed right after the RDP, I'm sure you know by now, was the Reconstruction and Development Program, which kind of was, I'd say, to an extent, socialist in nature, right? In that it was geared towards servicing the needs of the you know, basics for the majority. And then, you know, Mbeki comes in with a system that is in most ways neoliberal. And
Right.
so we've sort of been sort of driving down that path for a while now. And I think it's the unraveling of like the neoliberal policies that were taken up after Mandela's RDP program that are now creating this huge inequality and, you know, big divide in our system.
Right, because I mean, you know, as you mentioned at the beginning of the film, and as sort of we go through, sort of the World Bank has said that South Africa is the most unequal nation, and you cover the protests that I guess seem to have been increasing in I guess frequency, and just where, you know, because it's not just workers, it's university students, and you touched on the Maracane, um,
Americana.
The Maracana mine shooting, which it just was like just hard to watch. But you know, and it wasn't the first time that it happened, that you sort of have this police freedom to use their guns, I guess. And yeah, I just wanted to, maybe because it was 2013 that Maracana happened.
Yes, August 2013. So
And
2013.
you know, over the past 7 years, has anything happened? Have the, you know, has there been sort of a push for better behavior by the police? I'm guessing, you know, since any change in like workers' rights, workers' treatment, just you know, how law enforcement behaves, any of that.
Sorry, it was August 2012,
Oh, okay.
not 2013. So, I mean, the massacre in Marikana was, you know, the biggest massacre since 1994, like post-apartheid South Africa. Um, and I think leading up to that, there's always been a sense in South Africa that Black life is cheap here, you know, that this democracy sort of protects the privileged few and mainly white people. You know, people kind of like spoke about this openly, but we hadn't actually seen how bad it can get. And with the rise of what we call service delivery protests, we sort of started seeing evidence of it. You know, the film speaks about Andries Tatane, who died a few years before Marikana, you know, sort of shot point blank, you know, in daylight, in the streets, while protesting. And so I think because there wasn't enough backlash towards that, the police in some way felt like they could do whatever it is that they want. I'm not sure if you're aware, but you know, Cyril Ramaphosa, who's our president now, was a board member at Lonmin at the mine where the massacre took place, where, you know, the workers were protesting for a wage increase. And so, you know, he sent an email to the Minister of Police and others saying that they should use, that there were criminal elements and they should use concomitant action. And so there was a domino effect, you know, from that email to, you know, conversations that were had by, you know, the Minister of Police and the mining bosses. The police were let off there. And I mean, we've seen evidence, video footage of what was happening there. You know, the miners were not charging at the police with weapons, but, you know, they were mowed down in broad daylight. And so this, I think really drove the point home that Black life is really cheap in South Africa. And we're, you know, even though we have, it feels like we just, you know, changed the skin color of our leaders, because, you know, something like this could only happen in apartheid South Africa. In no one's imagination could we see this happening in post-apartheid. And so, I mean, it sends shockwaves throughout the world, and because it really was a wake-up call. But it was also just a reminder about how, you know, when the private sector gets in bed with government, the kind of atrocities that, you know, that could come about. Because, I mean, if we're asking real questions about who the police were protecting, you know, they were protecting private property, and this is, you know, the national police.
Right, right. It's interesting. Yesterday when we watched this film, it was Martin Luther King Day, and so it was sort of looking at, as you said like your statement that you know, that Black life is cheap, and it, as you could see from the past year with you know, the Black Lives Matter movement, that it seems to be a universal it continues to be a universal thing that you know, this whole concept of the lack of importance or the lack of gravity perhaps that people see Black lives. And you know, we were just thinking about how even as he is lionized and canonized, I'm sure in the same way that, you know, Nelson Mandela is they were not popular in their time, right? When they were doing what they were doing. And and you know, I mean, Martin Luther King was assassinated, right? Because he was fighting for these rights in a similar manner. And it brings me back to what we were talking about at the beginning of this, of like, you know, is this some sort of, is this a trap, right? Are we in this process? And I think at the end of your film, where we were talking about, like, you ended with just the thought of a woman being able to walk and see the stars at night without fear. Like, I don't know what, maybe you can talk about how you got to using that as the closing thought in our conversation about this. Like, why was that the...
Yeah, so I mean, I was trying to sort of imagine a South Africa that is different, right? A South Africa that is not the rape and murder capital of the world. And, you know, a lot of people, when talking about crime, for example, do not usually directly associate it with dispossession, and about how you know, people are still living in sort of like racialized ghettos in South Africa, you know, and, you know, that a lot of people are unemployed. We have, I think we're close to 40% now, 40% unemployment rate. You know, we have a 60% youth unemployment rate. And so it's when we have conversations about violence, often we don't associate that violence with dispossession. And so I think for me, it was kind of like a natural progression, because I was trying to also end the film in a not so bleak note. The first cut of the film was 3 hours, and it was just 3 hours of like people just whinging. It wasn't a film, it was just
it was a detox.
yeah, yeah. It was detox, and you could tell that a lot of the contributors have been dying to talk about these things for a while. You know, it felt like a breakthrough. But I think as a film, as a cultural product or a piece of entertainment, it was just like, maybe this is too much kind of thing. And I really wanted to find something at the end that was going to bring some sort of hope, you know, some
Right,
sort of reprieve. Um, and I think then it was really just about that, about whether or not we can imagine a South Africa that's different, you know? And so what I was imagining is also just about like how we went from sort of like fighting a human rights struggle. And then soon after that in 1994, we kind of like saw the rise of like, sort of like gender struggle and, the rights of like sort of the LGBTQI community to be free. And which is again going back to our constitution, where one of the first, one of the first constitutions in the world, but it's the first on the continent to include gay rights, right? But at the same time, we still have like the highest number of corrective rape incidents in the world. And so, again, this schizophrenic existence, these dichotomies where, everything looks really good on paper, but what is it that we're doing to kind of like imagine and actualize a really free South Africa where we can actually walk around and not feel threatened,
right, right, right.
you
No, I
know?
mean, yeah, and I like, because you mentioned it and I haven't touched on it yet, that you went back, because often our histories and I think especially histories of oppression um, tend to be very immediate without going back and back and back. And I like how you're in your film, you went back to the 1600s, right? And sort of like the beginning of the entry of white people into South Africa and the impact, and the various aspects of it. And I think that was very powerful in the conversation. But and then when and I think, because when we talk also about the trap, there was a conversation about reparations, right? I think there was the decision to pay out 30,000 flat instead of sort of over time. And again, the reparations conversation is one that has happened, since slaves were freed in the United States. And again, it's almost like, is this a trap where maybe, and I don't know if you have any thoughts of that, where maybe we are, sort of, we end up talking about something that may never happen because of the system that exists as it is, with, the powers where they are and how they operate. And does that keep us from looking at different ideas to get to, the point at the end of your film with, the freedom to see the stars without fear, almost?
Yeah. I I hold a kind of, sorry, I don't know if you can hear the birds. They're very loud outside.
I have an opinion.
Yeah. I hold a cynical view about reparations, because I don't think that they'll come without force, without some form of violence, you know, as they say that, was it Frantz Fanon who said that power conceals nothing without violence? I might be misquoting here, but it's the way I see it, right? In that there's so much influence on, sort of like private sector influence on government, and the people who really hold the key when it comes to money, often are private companies, you know, that control industry, that control the economy, you know. And I feel that, especially in South Africa, that we haven't done enough to even sort of convince them that it's possible for us to try and get reparations. I don't think they'll come from our government. I don't think it will come from our leaders. And I think that it won't take one, you know, protest. I think, you know, if we want to talk about reparations, we kind of almost have to talk about revolution in kind of the same conversation. But then, as I said in the beginning, it might just be a cynical view, and, you know, maybe, you know.
It could be your next film. It could be, because I feel as though, which, you know, you mentioned, I mean, this is a great film, and I almost feel like it's like a jumping board where like there's still so many things we've realized. There's still so many things we have to learn, and there's still so many areas where, you know, there's we can dive in even further.
Yeah, I really felt that the, you know, the Rainbow Projects in 1994 touched very little. That, you know, it was like putting a bandage on a bullet wound, because I feel like we're back. The you know, the racists are emboldened again for some reason now. You know, like racism is just on the rise in South Africa. You know, racist incidents, but also just like sentiments and rhetoric. And, you know, we're, you know, the most unequal society in the world, which means the majority, you know, living below the breadline or the poverty line. And so you really wonder what it is that, you know, that 1994 did for us, you know, other than avert a war, which may have been necessary. But I then realized that each of the topics that we speak about in the film, there's an opportunity for, you know, for me to explore them, try and, you know, sort of like, you know, have a full exploration of each one. And one, definitely like reconciliation. It's becoming clear that in South Africa, like, it's, you know, and we haven't reconciled, and it's becoming urgent that we, you know, start to deal with it, start having conversations about what it means to live together, you know.
Right. And I think I want us to end on a happy note. So, because I don't want this interview to be like the 3-hour version of your film. Because you know, I really want to say that your film it's not a whinging session. It really is. It's insightful, it's powerful, and I, you know, I want to make sure we end with people knowing that, and knowing that in all of these conversations that you have with the people, and all of the information that you're sharing, we do come away more enlightened, and probably, as you're, to your point, sort of inspired to think about the things that we you know, how to resolve some of these things. It's like, and because that's how you solve a problem, right? You're like, you identify what exactly what it is, and I think you did a great job of that, sort of diving into things, and then the way forward. So yeah, I want
Yeah,
to thank you for that.
thanks. Yeah, I think to some degree, I also wanted to highlight sort of like the human spirits, the resilience of the South African people, and also just about how we were always able to find solutions, you
Right.
know. I was actually looking because South Africans are also known for their dancing, like throughout the world. Like, people talk about how much South Africans dance, and you see it a lot in like adverts here. A lot of people are sick of it actually. Like, oh, another ad where people are dancing. We dance for everything in this country. We even dance when we're protesting, and so. But I was one of the voices that were speaking out against the dancing and saying, we're seeing just so much dancing. But it also kind of like I was reminded of like the spirits that comes with that, that out of everything that happened and out of everything that's happening, you can still get up and enjoy yourself and feel free and dance. So that for me was a wonderful reminder of the spirit of the South African people and their resilience.
No, and I think it's great. And so with that, I want to thank you for this time, Sifiso.
Thank you.
I look forward to this film is going to be screened during the upcoming festival. So and hopefully beyond, because I think it has a universal message um, in the teachings that we're learning from this particular situation.
Thank you so much. I hope people get to see it, and I hope it starts conversations about the similarities we may have also.
Right, right, right. No,
Yeah.
thank you so much.